There's similarities in the evolution between AI and the internet. The internet and AI probably started around the mid-1950s. Generation 1.0 of the internet was content-driven. Most of the consumers of the internet early on in the 1.0 version were just looking at content that was already available on the internet and were just consumers and viewers of that content. Internet 2.0 was something I was quite involved in. I spent about 10 years in my career with Sun Microsystems and Netscape. The internet browser came out, and what it did is it consumerized the internet. It brought the internet to the masses, that it was a user interface that just exploded the internet. It made it consumable by everyone. And there were a number of missteps along the way with people trusting the data that came out, what was provided to them. The version 3.0 of the internet will be AI driven. So 2.0 was user created content now provided to the internet. 3.0 will be AI content and query capabilities, and that's where we are now. On the AI side, now the chatbots that we're all seeing, even before the chatbots, just even some of our cell phones and some of the Internet of Things in our homes, we're using tooling of AI. And again, we're seeing this same trend. So the AI has been around since the 1950s, but now we're seeing that evolution where now AI is consumerable based on these chatbots. And the same growing pains that we had from the internet and everyone just accepting the information that was provided to them, thinking it was all accurate and so forth. But we're in the same historic pattern right now. So I'd like to maybe start out with Colonel J.C. Vega. Can you maybe level set the audience here about maybe machine learning and AI and so forth?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out here. Beautiful day here in Florida. The humidity's not too bad. Let's start with a poll. Who has used AI? Raise your hand. Okay. Who has used a private form of AI? Who has not used AI? Okay, so everyone who raised your hand, I think it's everybody, go to Sam's booth afterwards and you can get that special prize. The idea, like Michael just said, it's in your hands now. You get to use it. It's not something that's out of reach where academics, those of us in industry, we were using different forms of it, but now we get to bring it home and do these things. But let me just give you some examples of some of the tools that are out there. You have machine learning. You have neural networks. You have large language models, LLMs. You have generative AI. What does that look like in the form of your everyday use? Okay, many of you have heard of Siri or Alexa. That's a form. Some of you have an awesome playlist, and the recommendations from your Spotify or whatever your Netflix or whatever streaming service you use on the movies you like to watch. That's an aspect of machine learning from the behaviors that it's picking up from you. The large language models. It's probably the one most of you are familiar with that you're using, ChatGPT and some of the others that are provided by different providers. And all these cool images with people with multiple fingers and different things of the generative AI of making images. You're using it right now. As you're using it, it's important to understand how they work. A misconception is that they think. AI does not think. It calculates. It calculates. There's an algorithm that says you're more likely to do this and this, and it runs the process here, and it calculates what the likelihood of that would be. Just like when you're typing something out. What's the likelihood of this next word coming up based on everything you've typed in there already? And it's usually good enough. But you also have to understand what its limitations are. What are the shortcomings and challenges associated with AI? Why are we starting with this? Because if you look at the schedule, AI, I think, is every other talk related to that. And for those of you headed to RSA, every tool out there is going to have AI in it. Just like blockchain before that, and just name it. It's going to be something like that. But what are the shortcomings? Are they sharing that with you? I mentioned private AIs, private LLMs. Okay? Public versus private is a thing. These are the questions that, as this is coming up, you want to start querying the vendors, the people pushing this to you. There's concerns with that because there's limitations, there's shortcomings, and some of them are pretty bad. We were talking about earlier using a different model. I wish we would use this for AI and any new technology, any new fad that we have. You hear something about a new pharmaceutical that's on television, and then you hear it's going to cause warts, it's going to cause you to die, it's going to cause it gives you all the warnings associated with it very quick, but at least it tells you that there's some pretty bad things that can happen from it also. But that's where you get to judge the risk and the reward. Because a lot of what you're hearing is the reward. You're not hearing about the risk. And so with that, once you know the risk, like anything else, you start to mitigate it. You accept it. You pass it on. Or you eliminate it. There's several things you can do once you understand the risk. But ask those questions. And then ask yourself, how do I get a hold of one of those private LLMs? What do I do with that? Because then you're really getting into it. But this is the thing, is as all these talks come on today, and we're going to cover some of the challenges here, ask yourself if this is all the great things, because the greater it is, usually the greater reward or the greater risk that you're accepting with that. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator.
Yeah, one of the missteps that we're seeing now, these early missteps, is that there's some confusion right now between consumer class AI and enterprise class AI. And no one should be using consumer class AI for their enterprises. You should be using an enterprise class AI that has your own intellectual property that is part of your private corpus of information. Why don't we talk a little bit about how we're seeing AI in tooling and so forth in the government, and let's talk about that in law enforcement. So I'll hand that over to Lawrence.
Thank you, Michael. First, I wanted to thank all of you guys for being here. Also, thank you to Digital Era Group for putting this together and for FIU hosting us. A few points, and following on with the statements from Michael about nobody should be really putting their corporate data, their mission-sensitive data into a ChatGPT, a public hosted site. If you read the fine print, they're all learning off of whatever you feed it. That's where you'd want to make sure that you're setting up in your businesses and in your workplaces. Either go out to AWS or go out to Azure or load up a model on a GPU that you guys can feed your own data, train that chatbot on your policies, on your procedures, so that if somebody asks it, what's the best way to form a password in my organization? What's the policy for setting up a system? You know that they're only getting the data that you want them to have. So also you're not leaking that data out. That's very critical. If you're exposing a chatbot that's going to be open to the public, say you want to give in Miami-Dade County's case, we're setting one up that will help you find a pet. Say you're very active and you want to adopt a dog, you can go to the Miami-Dade County site soon and put in the attributes that you would like to have in a dog. Hey, I have this type of lifestyle. I like to go to the beach. I like to run. Help me find a dog. The LLM will go search our it's a privately hosted LLM that we've exposed to the internet. It will check the database of the currently available dogs and give you results based on what you're looking for. We're protecting that with a layer behind the web page that lets us make sure nobody's abusing our data set, harvesting it for whatever reason. We're doing rate limiting. We're making sure that we have a control there. So you have to have some type of control layer to make sure your data is not being abused.
So from our perspective in law enforcement proper, right, so we have a couple challenges. First and foremost is we have to investigate certain things that come to cybersecurity and come to deal with AI specifically. In order to do that, we have to adopt tools, because from the naked eye, a law enforcement officer that doesn't have that experience doesn't have the ability to go out and say, yeah, that's AI generated. Some of it's really bad, so you can tell, but the way technology is catching up to us, they're getting really good. And I run a very large team of analysts for a law enforcement perspective, right? I have over 40 analysts. We have a full-time real-time information center. We provide intel for the entire agency and the region. So not only do we deal in the cyber domain, the physical and cyber domain are coming together so quickly. Threats are moving at a faster pace. Threat vectors are opening up. You no longer have to be that genius in understanding it. Something else can write code for you. Something else can write a malicious email. Something else can send a malicious email. For our standpoint, we're dealing with a number of things. Our law enforcement officers are working in one of the most complex working environments we've ever seen. We're asking them to do a lot more with a lot less. The other thing is, what do you think the percentage out of the 800,000 law enforcement officers in the country are that have a cyber background, that have some kind of tech background, that have some kind of capability? I'm guaranteeing you it's low, right? Now, law enforcement's playing catch up. So now what we're doing is we're going to find that. Not only are we building our private public sector capabilities and getting with industry to find out people with lived experiences in this field to understand what are we facing, but we're also training the men and women of law enforcement. And guess what happens? You guys take them. We train them, we send them to all these schools, and then some private sector company comes and takes them away and pays them a lot more money than you'll make in the public sector. So that's one challenge that we have. The other challenge we have is jurisdictional boundary when we come to cybersecurity legislation, things of that nature. And then what Lawrence talked about. Our deputies, our troopers, our law enforcement officers, they want to come in, they want to turn their laptops on. They would not recognize a cyber attack if there was matrix level looking code. They would just shut the laptop off and throw it to the corner. They probably wouldn't report it for about 3 to 4 days and then say, hey, my computer doesn't work. We are also trying to stop them from using generative AI to solve problems. So now what we have to do is go build a chat GPT for law enforcement, right? We have to compartmentalize our data sets. Not only that, we have to deal with civil rights, civil liberties issues as well, right? So we teach our law enforcement officers what to do, what not to do. We're teaching them a ton of criminal justice capabilities and tactics and techniques and tradecraft. But now we got to go on the backside of that and teach them technical tradecraft. We've got to teach them how to be smarter when they're dealing with on a security level. Hey, don't open that Starbucks gift card because no one sent it to you. Yeah, the SWAT rock looks really nice, but do not open the email selling SWAT rocks for $5. So we have a lot of capability in the organizations coming up, and law enforcement chiefs and executives are getting a lot smarter in the space, but we're facing a domain, a digital domain that is moving so rapidly that we are going to struggle keeping up.
So I started a hobby about 5 or 6 years ago of a security leaders roundtable. It's grassroots, no cost, no sponsors, no selling policy, Chatham House rules. These gentlemen are co-champions of the Florida chapter. There's now 25 chapters. It's called Security Leaders Roundtable. The acronym is SECRET, SEC for security. RT for roundtable.us is the domain if anyone's interested in participating. But where I'm going with this is we've had a lot of conversations on these roundtables about they're very collaborative. In fact, they're intended to be collaborative, no presentations. People are now starting to put controls in their environment, whether or not they're allowing their users to access maybe some of these consumer class AI environments. So you can put up some of these barriers, but your users are always going to figure out a way around the barriers that you might impose on them. Even if you do block and tackle from any tooling that they're using for that, they may start using their home computers, they may start using their mobile phones, and so forth. One particular instance, very recently, was a local government RFP, and it was a small number of selected respondents that could be working on that RFP. And some of the respondents, I don't even think it was just one, but some of the respondents to that RFP actually started putting the questions of that RFP into something like a ChatGPT. And what had happened now is all of this private information for the select number of vendors that were able to participate in that RFP, now all of that information became trained data in the public corpus of information of that AI platform. And now they had to actually tell all of the respondents, you're not allowed to use AI for any of it. So we're going to see a lot of these missteps where people don't really think about all of the implications. Let's talk about maybe some of those missteps. Maybe JC, do you want to weigh in on some of this?
Sure. First of all, question for the audience, and you can win a prize at Sam's booth. Who has an AI policy at their place of work? Okay, raise your hands. Hi. Who's read the AI policy? Okay, keep your hands up now. Those of you who read it, how many of you wrote it? Okay, that's about right. The only people who are going to read it are those who wrote it. You can count on that. But the idea is to make the policy the practice so that they reinforce one another. And if you tell someone they can't do it, like Michael just gave the example of, you can't do this, you can't do that. Being 30 years in the military, we had a term that Joe's going to find a way. He's going to find a way to get around whatever you told them they can or cannot do. So don't make it hard for them to not do it. Make it easy for them to do the right thing. So we give a couple of examples that you all hear about, but we don't always hear the follow-on. We heard the example before of the lawyer who submitted a brief that was all AI generated and lost his license and bar, whether it's folklore or not. You've all heard something similar to that. Someone who put it to take the MCATs for medical school and failed, but then the follow-on is that since then it has learned and now it can do that. So the idea that it's learning, and for those of you who deal with the law at all, there's niche companies out there that specialize in AI with different cases that have already been settled for precedent. So while we hear all the bad things, it's learning faster than we are. What are the bad things? First of all, couches under the umbrella. One of the slides that you see up there is information. This is under that category of information, misinformation, disinformation, misaligned information. In my business, when I was in the government, we dealt with propaganda, things like that, only on foreigners in foreign countries, never in the United States, because we're not allowed to, and that's true. Serious about that. But what are we talking about, this misinformation, when it comes to AI? The idea is, or those concepts are hallucination. You all heard about that, hallucination in AI? Okay, so hallucination is where there's missing information in the data set. It fills it in to satisfy the user, you at the end of the keyboard. Okay, it's made up. Other part is incomplete data. It doesn't have all the information, so it'll leave stuff out. If you ask it, I heard from some of the speakers earlier, different frameworks. You say, give me an outline of a framework of this one. It will look really good. It may be complete, but an expert will look at it and say, you know what? It's not all the way there. It's missing something. But for the average user, it may be good enough. But the idea is It does have incomplete information. The part that really scares me, especially in your business with government, because I'm no longer in government anymore, is the bias. That bias is something, if you look at it, it's fed by data from books, data from everything that's ever been published on the internet. Where is that generated from? Who are the contributors to that over the lifetime of creating knowledge? They don't all look very diverse. And I'm not saying that diversity is a thing that a DEI is something that the AI has to deal with. What I'm saying is that if the knowledge that a government is using is based on biased information that is good enough for something, but may affect a different part of society in a different way, someone might say that's good enough and we're going to go on because I got my work done, while the other person is saying, what the hell happened to me in that? There's that bias. The conforming to social norms, those shift. I don't think anyone could have predicted where our country is politically today, say 3 elections ago, of just how bad the extreme on the left or right is. But that is the social norm today. The AI takes some of that into account and doesn't necessarily capture the true picture of everything that's going on. It's by what's being published. You can't find an article out there that's not biased by the mainstream media one way or the other. That bias gets put into the database. Drift. That's where the answer changes over time. And it may not be changing at the same rate. Think of economics. Think of climate. Think of all these different things that it's calculating this must be the rate of change and this is how it's going to be and we're going to melt tomorrow because our data from the last year shows that we're growing at this extreme. But the idea is that the truth, the facts, are not necessarily complete or the truth. You can label it under the misinformation, disinformation, and it may not necessarily be intentional, but the ones you really got to worry about are the intentional attempts.
So we had a small misstep with our Watson at one point when we started teaching Watson the Urban Dictionary. And Watson started using some language that maybe we weren't that comfortable with over at IBM. So we had to actually revise some of that. The White House has just come out with some privacy and governance mandates around AI. And which is actually, if you think about it, there's a number of nations that are all now participating in some ways to use AI. Unfortunately, the bad actors are not part of that collaborative, but so they don't have to fight with their one arm tied behind their back. But let's talk a little bit about some of the privacy and governance aspects. I'll just weigh in first that most of the barn doors were open when most of the AI environments were doing their training environment. I'm very proud of my own organization. We're very careful in how they were teaching Watson. So we might be a little bit more ahead of the curve in not accepting a hypothesis without understanding how it arrived at that hypothesis, which foundational models we used, what percentage of bias could have been determined from that answer as well. Everyone is scrambling towards that. But let's all weigh in a little bit on the privacy and governance.
Sure, really quickly. Again, as we venture into AI, setting it up for our organizations, it's very important that you reach across boundaries or silos to make sure you're involving your legal teams, make sure you're involving anyone who is responsible for privacy, anyone who may be on the risk management team to help you make sure that you're not putting out anything that's going to put your organization at risk for sharing too much. And I'll say this, collaboration, reaching out to your friends, your colleagues, other people here, that's going to be a huge help for us.
Yeah, from our perspective, is data is the new currency, right? Let's face it. It is absolutely something incredible we look at. We have breach data that we're looking at now, so imagine these models and consuming large amounts of breach data, which they do already. In law enforcement, we have to go train our analysts on how to handle breach data when they come across it, right? So the open source intelligence space is very large. Whether you have a data model consuming that or not, we still have to look at the ethics and compliance of it. So we train our analysts to be understanding, try to take the bias out as much as possible, but it is difficult, right? Because biases is based on a number of things, right? The way you were raised, the culture you came from, things of that nature. It's like point and counterpoint is the way we need to go to, not necessarily one side or the other, right? Here's your point, here's your counterpoint, and try to go into the center-driven lane as much as possible. But you have to train your folks. You can train them on AI is going to be simple to use, right? You have to train the people in your organizations to understand how to properly use these models, these companies, organizations. When we bring people in from this capability, we make sure that they come in and train. We make sure they understand their civil rights, civil liberties models, our 28 CFRs and things of that nature. So our governance is super, super important, but you have to train your people.
So is that clock right? Okay. So let me just wrap up. We'll be out around the event. Please reach out to all of us. If you're interested in participating on the Grassroots Security Leaders Roundtable chapter for Florida or one of the other chapters nationwide, just see me. I'll just need your email address. I don't have to vet anyone. I don't believe in here. We've 6 years. We haven't had any Zoom bombers taking their clothes off on any of these. Let's not start that. Anyway, so just see me and give me your email address, and I'm happy to have you in the collaborative. Thank you very much for your time.